We are honored to have with us today Michael Hoffmann from ETH Zurich. He is a well-known computational geometer and combinatorial geometer. And today I'll tell us about monotone arc diagrams with few biarcs.
Thank you, Adam. So this is joint work with Stephen Chaplik, Henry Förster, and Michael Kaufmann that we started many years ago at a workshop, and it has evolved since then. And now this is kind of the latest and greatest iteration. But there's still a couple of rather basic questions that we don't know the answer to. So maybe one of you has some idea what to do about this. So this is an arc diagram over here. Kind of, you can see like all the edges, there's this colorful mess there, kind of color is chosen by length. And this connects different occurrences, I think, of names of people in some famous book. And this is also a typical application of using these kind of diagrams, which I will tell you in a second what they are. So everything that has a kind of linear structure behind it, such as a movie or a book, right, that kind of has pages that are kind of linearly arranged, or just time more generally. So what is it, this arc diagram? It's just a drawing of a graph, well, a planar graph, so that we place all these vertices on a line, like linearly, that we call the spine. That's this yellow thing here. And all the edges are represented as a curve that consists of some sequence of semicircles. So in the simple most cases, we have a single semicircle, and that we call a proper arc, such as this edge down here. Or it can also be a sequence, and they are centered on the spine, which also means that these edges that are composed of these sequences, they may cross the spine, such as this thing here. And if it consists of two of such semicircles, then I call it a biarc. And they come in at least two flavors, these biarcs. One of them is this monotone one here, where monotonicity is with respect to the spine. And there's another one here, which is also a biarc. It's a concatenation of two semicircles. And this one is not monotone with respect to the spine. Of course, every single one, if you pick your favorite such biarc, you could just by rearranging things along the spine, cyclically shifting, make monotone. But like if you have several of those collectively, then that's not so clear and not so obvious. Anyway, in principle, an arc diagram could also have edges that are composed of even more semicircles like this. But for all the purposes within this talk, we will stop at most two of them, these biarcs. So one basic question that we may ask is, do we actually need any of these kind of more fancy type of edges? Why not just go with the proper arcs? They seem much nicer. They seem just aesthetically and functionally nicer because they are easier to grasp what they do. But of course, there is a reason that sometimes you may want to have some of those. But even then, you may want to ask the question, how much of them, to what extent do we actually need them? Or quantified, how many of them do we need? So in this nice case, so to say, where we just do away with biarcs and triarcs and everything more complicated, we just have arcs that live on one side of the spine. And this is also known as a two-page book embedding. And it's also very well known what kind of graphs allow such a representation. So what you can see is that all these edges, and you should think of this spine now as a cyclic order. So all the edges between guys that are consecutive on the spine, they are essentially free to add in the sense that they cannot possibly cross anything. We call that we want to maintain an embedding, so we don't allow edge crossings here. So in other words, you can always make this graph Hamiltonian. If those edges are not there already to begin with, you could add them and you wouldn't cross anything. So these graphs, they are what is called sub-Hamiltonian planar, meaning they are a subgraph of a Hamiltonian planar graph. And this implication, the existence of such a representation and being sub-Hamiltonian planar, goes both way. It's also not too difficult to prove. It's one small result in this paper by Bernhard and Kainen, where they studied this also for more general number of pages. But this is one of the most well-known settings because it so nicely corresponds to plane drawings to begin with if we just have 2 pages to work with. All right, that also means that some planar graphs do not admit such a representation because we do know, and I will say a little bit more about this later, that there are some planar graphs that are not Hamiltonian. And there are hence maximal planar graphs that are not Hamiltonian, so they are also not sub-Hamiltonian because to a maximal planar graph we couldn't add possibly any edge to make it Hamiltonian or not. We just cannot add any edge. So that's why people started looking into these more general type of edges, where the next most simple thing, arguably, would be to have edges that are monotone still with respect to the spine as the proper arcs were, but now they are allowed to cross the spine, but say every edge at most once, and then we arrive at these biarcs. And Di Giacomo and others, they showed a long time ago that you can always do this for every planar graph. You can represent it using these type of edges. In my opinion, it's a bit unfortunate that they call these type of drawings topological book embeddings, because it's actually obviously not a book embedding, because in a book embedding you cannot cross the spine. Yet that's one term that is used. So in this case, then it's a monotone topological book embedding because all of the edges are monotone. And you can always draw every planar graph like that, but it's quite obvious if you look at this example here that a lot of these biarcs, in this case, actually for this particular graph, all of them, but in general, at least some of them can be replaced by proper arcs. So that raises the question, how many biarcs are needed, both for a specific graph at hand maybe, or for the members of some family of graphs? Or if we talk about graph families, just what is the kind of maximum number that is needed, or what is the minimum number that we can buy with and represent all graphs? So why is this an interesting question? Well, besides these aesthetic criteria that I appealed to already in the beginning, there's also a connection to Hamiltonicity, obviously, right? Because the Hamiltonian ones don't need any of them. So we can think of this as a quantified distance to Hamiltonicity. Or to be precise, if we have such a biarc diagram, if we just subdivide all the edges that are represented at biarcs, and we imagine putting the subdivision vertex on the spine, then we get a proper arc diagram, or a 2-page book embedding of this augmented graph. Right, so here I have to subdivide these two, and then I can make it like this, and then actually you see that this graph now is Hamiltonian. So subdividing some number of edges, each edge at most once. So the number of those, if I can do this with at most k edges, then I can find such a biarc diagram. And if I have such a biarc diagram, then subdividing them in this fashion, that makes the graph sub-Hamiltonian. So we can kind of call the minimum number of biarcs needed the Hamiltonicity defect of that graph. And subdivision is one way to look at modifications of the edges. Now, we can also think of edge flips, of course, instead. If the graph is a triangulation, then edge flips in triangulation is a very well-studied topic. And if you now imagine this biarc, the edge that corresponds to this biarc, if instead of subdividing you would flip it, that would also get rid of the spine crossing, and instead you would get an edge that connects to vertices that are consecutive along the spine. So assuming that these flips are independent, meaning the triangles that are involved in them don't overlap so that there are no interdependencies, so in the terminology of edge flips, they are simultaneously flippable, then the number of these flips also corresponds to the number of or the maximum number of edges that we need to flip to get to a Hamiltonian graph. And that we have many years ago with a couple of people, we worked on this and showed that every planar graph on n vertices you can draw in such a biarc diagram where at most roughly n/2 of the edges. So think of the planar graphs here always as being maximal planar, so they have roughly 3n edges, say, so 1/6 of the edges about are drawn as biarcs, and the remaining ones can always be drawn as proper arcs. So this is an upper bound, n/2. And then using this connection to edge subdivisions and edge flips, we could, so these are not necessarily monotone. So as in the example up here, you can have these kind of edges. We have no control over this in the way we argue there. And using this connection, we could improve the diameter bound on the so-called combinatorial flip graph on triangulations, which is kind of the natural flip graph that you do, but on the maximal planar graph, on the abstract graph setting, not the geometric setting. And we could improve this to 5n. So maybe that's one other reason to be interested in this kind of quantity, that there's a connection here. So I told you just that we can do with n/2. And the obvious next question would be, well, what's the floor corresponding to that ceiling? So this is basically in this observation here, that there are planar graphs, and there are infinite families of planar graphs that require about n/3 biarcs, or n/3 edges to be subdivided to make them sub-Hamiltonian. And this is a class of graphs that I would like to tell you a little bit more about. So let's see. First of all, we know that if we want to insist on having a biarcs, we need a non-Hamiltonian graph to begin with. So how do non-Hamiltonian maximal planar graphs look like? And this is the smallest one you can build. So you take A, or rather V, because combinatorially speaking, there's just one triangulation on 5 vertices, and as a starting point. And now we just look at all the faces, of which there are 6, and we add a new vertex in each of these faces. That's 6 more vertices, so we are at 11 vertices. And now we just do the thing to connect it to a triangulation. We connect every vertex to the 3 vertices on the boundary of the face that they were added in. Now this is a graph, a triangulation, a maximal planar graph on 11 vertices, and we can wonder, can it be possibly Hamiltonian? Well, if so, we need to have a cycle through all the vertices, right? But however, these new vertices that we added in the second step, the green ones, they form an independent set. No 2 of them are adjacent. They are only adjacent to 3 orange vertices that were already there before. So in particular, if you look at how these green vertices are connected in any cycle, Hamiltonian cycle also, then they must be incident to 2 green edges, right? However, that just means we have a triangulation on 11 vertices, which means a Hamiltonian cycle would have to have 11 edges, of which at least 12 are green. That doesn't quite work out. So that's a contradiction, and hence there cannot be a Hamiltonian cycle just because this independent set is too large. We have only 5 vertices of one type, 6 of the others, and that just doesn't work. So this graph is, it's the smallest non-Hamiltonian maximal planar graph. It's also known as Goldner-Harari graph, and it's the only one on 11 vertices as well. But the construction that we just did, we can generalize, and it's just very easy. Instead of this 5 vertex triangulation, we just start with any triangulation on k vertices, and we do the same game in every face. So if you have k vertices in the triangulation, then we have 2k minus 4 faces. And in each of these faces, we add a new vertex that gives us k plus 2k minus 4, which is 3k minus 4 vertices. And any Hamiltonian cycle, this is still an independent set, must have at least twice as many as we have new vertices, which is 4k roughly green edges. And of course, that already didn't work out for k equal to 5. And the larger we make the k, the worse this relation is gonna get. So in this way, we get a large family, and that's probably the most well-known family of non-Hamiltonian maximal planar graphs that there is, because it's so easy to find a certificate for non-Hamiltonicity, which in general is difficult, right? We also know that it's NP hard to decide whether a given maximal planar graph is Hamiltonian or not. Okay, these guys are also known as Kleetopes, named after Victor Klee. And they are an interesting family, which also includes some planar 3 trees and some other graphs, because the starting triangulation is actually arbitrary. So just to summarize the state of affairs with respect to general biarcs and how many of them are needed to represent a planar graph in such an arc diagram, we can define this Hamiltonicity defect as a parameter. The Hamiltonicity defect of a graph G is just the minimum number of biarcs that we can use where we minimize over all possible arc diagrams of this, where we are only allowed to use proper arcs or biarcs. And then we can define this in terms of n, right? That's just the worst graph on n vertices. We can wonder what is this quantity, and what I have basically proven you now is this lower bound of n over 3. That was the quantity that we got from the cletopes. And the upper bound is just that I mentioned in passing that we did prove this. But this is not what I want to tell more about. Instead, as the title suggested, I want to talk about the monotone case. So that we can define the same quantities, of course, also with the additional restriction added that all of the biarcs must be monotone with respect to the spine. So by the way, if you have any questions along the way, I guess people are raising their hand, or you are managing this, Adam. If there's anything, just feel free to interrupt me. But
I think our general approach is that we have no manners, and anyone can ask whatever they want, whenever they want,
very good.
unless you don't like that.
No. It's okay. So this is this monotone scenario where we could even further distinguish, like, we have two types of monotone biarcs, depending on in which direction they cross the spine, like from, say, top to bottom or bottom to top, or we call them up-down or down-up, if we read them from left to right. And this monotone Hamiltonicity defect is just the same as the previous one, just with the additional restriction to be monotone for these biarcs. Then, of course, the lower bound translates by adding additional requirements. We cannot possibly get by with fewer biarcs. The upper bound, however, does not. So that's a question here that I will give some answers to, what we can put in place of this question mark here. But more generally, the question that I don't have any answer to is the following: is there any penalty for requiring monotonicity? So is there even any graph for which we need strictly more monotone biarcs than general biarcs? And I don't know of any example. And you think of what might be plausible graphs to try it out on. You might think that maybe cletopes are a good candidate, because after all, they have lots of biarcs. So requiring all of these to be monotone might be a more severe restriction than if you had just like one you could always make monotone. However, as it turns out, this is just completely wrong. So cletopes are not good candidates to check, because for cletopes we actually get a tight bound even with monotonicity, and that's one of the things I will show you. So we need to, if you want to, of course, it would also be fine to show that there's no such penalty, but so I don't know this either. Would be an interesting question to resolve, I think. All right, so this is just the summary of the new results that we obtained. This is for 3 classes of graphs, basically. The first one is for general planar graphs. We showed that you can get by with roughly 4/5 times n monotone biarcs, which of course is still much worse than the n over 2 without this restriction, but at least it beats a previous bound where the coefficient for the n was 1 times n. So now that's at least some epsilon that I can still see with my bare eyes below 1. And for planar 3 tree, we have even slightly better bound, but still not at 1/2, which is 3/4. And for cletopes, we have an absolutely tight bound up to the additive constant. And this is kind of the first thing that I want to talk about, given that we already talked about cletopes in detail before.
Can you remind me what a 3 tree is?
Yes, I will get to that. I will define it basically later on. So it's a triangulation that you can obtain by starting from a single triangle and then take any member of that class, choose one triangular face, and add a new vertex and connect it to the three guys on the boundary in a similar fashion as we did for the cletopes. That's a planar 3 tree, or I could just say it's a planar graph with tree width at most 3. But I think that the first one is maybe more helpful. But it's the same. Okay?
Thanks. Yes.
All right. So then let's get into bounds for monotone biarcs. And I want to start with this slightly older result, where this is from the same paper where we showed the n-half upper bound for general biarcs. Kind of in passing, we gave this 1 times n bound, upper bound on the number of monotone biarcs. And this turns out, a slight modification of this turns out helpful to get the tight bound for cletopes. So I first want to tell you how this works. Also because it's proving this is a very nice exercise and application of canonical orderings. So we often give this as a homework exercise to students in our geometry class so that they can practice with canonical orderings, of course, with some hints of how to approach it. So let's talk about monotone arc diagrams. We have, besides biarcs, we have these 2 types of edges. So I will now look at this kind of partial drawing where I add vertices by one. And then there are basically, among the proper arcs, there are 2 types. The one that are drawn below the spine, which we call pocket, and the one that are above the spine, which we call mountain. So we insert the vertices in a canonical order. Does everyone know what is a canonical order, or do you want me to go over it? It's your choice. I have a slide for it, but if everybody anyway knows what it is, then I don't need to tell you.
Maybe
I don't
it's
think you'll
better.
manage to get an answer.
Yeah.
So,
John?
sorry?
Better to see what you mean. Yes.
Okay, good. Then let's see. So I don't want to give the formal definition and the likes, but the too long, the TLDR version of this is it's a vertex ordering in which we incrementally build the graph. If you want to read it backwards, it's similar to a shelling kind of, but now we want to build something, so we play the movie forward, so to say. And at each point in time, we maintain that all the vertices that have been considered so far, they form a triangulation as much as possible, meaning that all bounded faces that we created are triangles, and the whole thing is biconnected, and we only ever add things on the outside, meaning in the outer face of the graph constructed so far. So in this particular example, for instance, we could start with this triangle. So we always have to start with a triangle. That's the smallest sensible case to make something biconnected. And then we have many choices in general in this order. But of course, not all permutations give a valid canonical ordering. But what we maintain is that we always add things on the outside. All bounded faces are triangled and everything is biconnected. In particular, every vertex that we add must have at least 2 neighbors that to what is already there. And there cannot be anything missing inside. So this is this in the outer face requirement. So that's a canonical ordering. These things always exist. That's maybe not trivially obvious if you haven't seen it, but it's something that one can prove. And they can even be computed in linear time. Okay. That's a canonical order. So we take one of these. And now we maintain this arc diagram. We add the vertices one by one, starting with the triangle. The triangle is easy to draw. We just draw everything as pocket. And now we maintain some invariants that allow us to bound the number of biarcs that we will create when we add these vertices one by one. So the first one is that all the arcs are either proper arcs, meaning pocket, mountain, or down-up biarcs. So not just biarcs, but even prescribed of a specific type. That's also something I had in the statement of all these theorems. The second one is everything that's on the outer face, which we view as kind of the top, the upper envelope. The lower envelope will always be the very first outer edge between the first 2 vertices. And everything will happen kind of above. That's this inside-out spirit of the canonical ordering provides. And they are all proper, so there's no biarc on the outer face. We have only pockets and mountains that we connect to. Then each vertex may spend 1 credit when it's inserted, and that credit can be used to create biarcs. So every biarc needs to be paid for with 1 credit, and this is where the n minus constant bound comes from, right? That every vertex can essentially create 1 biarc. So for instance, this biarc here, somebody must have paid for it and put a credit there. And then every mountain whose left endpoint is on the outer face of the current graph must also carry 1 biarc, 1 credit. And the idea is that we could at any time later use this credit to make it into a biarc. So in this particular example up there, we have 3 mountains whose left endpoint is on the outer face still, so they need to carry a credit to satisfy this invariant. But for instance, this mountain here, not, because it's not on the outer face of the graph anymore. Okay, that's a bunch of invariant, but they are each so simple that I hope it all makes sense. If not, please just interrupt me. So now the question is, if we get vertex now in this canonical ordering, then how can we maintain these invariants? To establish them initially, as I said, you can just draw the triangle as 3 pockets. It's easy. There are no mountains. There are no credits to be paid. And that's also where the -4 in the end comes in the statement. From the first 3 vertices, and the very last one also doesn't need a credit. So, but in general, a vertex that comes, it will be connected to at least 2 vertices that are already there. In general, possibly many more. And we look at all these edges, so it will cover at least 1 edge also of this outer face, possibly more. And there are 2 cases. Either one of these edges is a pocket, at least one. This is the first case. And then we will just place this vertex inside the rightmost pocket that it covers. So in this case, it covers 2, one of which is this here. This is the rightmost one, so this is where we will drop it. We put it there on the spine. All the vertices have to be placed on the spine after all. And now we have to handle these edges. And we will draw the 2 edges that go to the neighbors along this pocket, of course, also as pockets. So that's easy. Pockets don't incur any cost. But now we also have possibly a lot of mountains to be drawn. So we need to see how we get the credits that need to be placed on them according to the invariant, right? So first of all, there are some edges to the left that we may need to pay for. Well, notice that actually only the leftmost one of those has still its left endpoint on the outer face. So only even if there are lots of edges to the left, only the very leftmost one still needs a credit, because only mountains with a left endpoint on the outer face needed a credit. So that's only one. And that's fine, because that's the credit that V has. We use this credit to pay for this edge. Then there's also possibly a number of edges to the right, but now the nice thing about the edges to the right is that each of them actually covers a mountain. Because after all, if one of these would have been a pocket, then there would be a pocket that's further to the right where we would have dropped the V instead. So by dropping it into the rightmost pocket, we ensure that all edges that go to the right, if any such edges exist, then the edge underneath covered is a mountain whose left endpoint is on the outer face. Actually, both endpoints are on the outer face, but not after adding V. After adding V, all of these mountains to the right don't have their left endpoint anymore on the outer face. So we can grab and take all their credits and put them on our new edges. So each of these edges will just take a credit of one of the mountains underneath. And this is how we can pay for them, even if there are lots of them. So that's why we need some kind of charging scheme like this to make such an argument work. So I hope that makes sense. And that's the first case. Now, of course, the other case is that there is no pocket at all that is covered by this new vertex V to be inserted. That's the second case. We only have mountains, possibly only one, possibly many. Anyway, we take the leftmost one. And now we have to make space. We have to put V on the spine. This is an arc diagram. Every vertex has to be on the spine. And hence, we we do what I call push down these mountains. We transform them into the type of biarc that we are allowed to use, namely down-up biarcs. So we do this with possibly many edges, all of the mountains that have this as their left endpoint, this first leftmost vertex that V connects to. But all of them, since they have their left endpoint on the outer face, they all have a credit that can pay to make them a biarc. Right? So hence we can do that. And we put them down like this. So now this credit is used to create a biarc there. And V we can drop here. And to the left, there's nothing to worry about, because to the left, we can draw the edge as a pocket, so no mountain to worry about. To the right, we have kind of the same story as before. Because as only mountains were covered, all edges to the right that are covered by V are also mountains whose left endpoint is on the outer face, but not anymore after adding V. So we can also grab all them credits and move them up to the edges incident to V to establish the invariant for all of these mountains whose left endpoint V is now on the outer face. And that concludes the argument. Right? So either it covers some pocket or it covers mountains only. In both cases, I have explained how we maintain these invariants. And since we assigned one credit to each vertex, then that overall gives something like n biarcs minus this constant for the first and last couple of guys. Okay, so there was this, right. So there was this one edge that I forgot, but nobody complained. You see, so they all cover except for the first one, which goes to the right endpoint of that thing that we pushed down. And of course, this edge doesn't cover anything, but that's why V has one credit to boot with, right? So we can use it to pay for this edge as well. Okay. Now, this proof, I hope it was clear. Otherwise, please complain. So this should be all easy to follow, hopefully. But the nice thing is that we can slightly modify this scheme and this drawing to establish an additional property that will help us handling cletopes. And that is, we can get the same bound, which is at most n-4 monotone biarcs of some fixed, so n-4 down-up biarcs, say. And in addition, we maintain that every triangle in this arc diagram crosses the spine. And by crosses the spine, I mean that in its relative interior, it contains some segment of the spine. So this triangle up here, it does not cross the spine. I mean, of course, all the vertices are on the spine, but the triangle itself, if you look just at the interior, it's strictly on one side. So this would not be valid according to this, right? But of course, we could redraw this first mountain there on the left like this. And now I hope all triangles in this little triangulation properly cross the spine. In particular, note that if we have a biarc, then both incident triangles always cross the spine, namely in a neighborhood of the crossing where the biarc crosses the spine, right? Then these parts will always be on the inside. So that's the nice thing about the biarcs. They make spine crossing triangles. But on the other hand, we don't want to use too many of them because we want to have this upper bound. But it's easy to show that we can get both. Namely, let's just go back to the previous scheme again. We had these two cases of insertion. So the first one was, if there's a pocket, we drop it into the rightmost pocket. We still do that. But now we have to, in addition, make sure that all the triangles cross the spine. So there are some triangles to the left to possibly worry about, as you can see. For instance, this very first triangle here, it certainly does not cross the spine as it stands. How can we fix this? Well, if it's a pocket, then it actually does cross the spine. If it's a biarc down here, then it also would cross the spine. Well, we cannot have biarcs on the outer face. So the only thing to worry about is a mountain. But then this mountain has its left endpoint on the outer face before we inserted V. So we can actually, instead of just forgetting about it or leaving it there for this leftmost edge, we can just push it down and transform it into a biarc, just as all the edges possibly underneath. Because if they are a mountain, then they have this credit. And in this way, all the triangles to the left will cross the spine. And to the right, it's the same story. So all but the very last edge, the last edge we keep as a mountain, but all of the other new edges here, they have a credit because the left endpoint V is on the outer face after its insertion, right? We borrowed all these, or we took all the credits from these guys out underneath there. But now instead of leaving this credit on the mountain, we just push down the edges, in this case just one, if there would be more, all of them, and directly transform them into a biarc. And then all of these new triangles cross the spine as well, because they have a biarc after all. Okay, so that's the first case. And we have all triangles cross the spine. In the second case, it's even easier because we only have the case to the right. All the interesting edges are to the right, and we just do the same thing, right? All the edges, except for the very last one, which we can keep as a mountain, all the other ones we make into biarcs, meaning that all of these triangles then nicely cross the spine, and they have the credit to pay for it because we put it there. So in this way, by this slight modification, using the same algorithm, we obtain this additional property. Why is it useful? Well, if a triangle crosses the spine, and we only use mountains, pockets, and up-down biarcs, then we can insert a degree 3 vertex into any such triangle without needing any biarc to connect it. So to see this, well, we can actually, without loss of generality, assume, so how does a triangle look like? It has these 3 vertices, right? Let's, the 2 extreme ones, the leftmost and the rightmost one, let's call the edge between those the long edge. And we can assume that this edge is the upper boundary of the triangle. If it would be the lower boundary, we just do a rotation by pi, which maintains everything. Actually, even the type of biarc remains the same under rotation by pi. So we just need to look at these 2 cases where we have either as a long edge a mountain or a biarc. And then down here, it doesn't really matter. We do know that we cannot have both of these a mountain, because then it would not be spine crossing. So this is either a pocket or a biarc. And here anyway, so we have this long edge. So what we just do is we place this degree 3 vertex here in this spine interval that we know is there by assumption. And then we just can follow this low edge, this long edge, to these 3 vertices using a proper arc. Like this and like this. So we just follow the long edge, in this case, this upper edge, hence we get all these mountains. And here we get this below the spine, and these, so they just follow this biarc. Now, of course, here these triangles need not necessarily cross the spine anymore. So here we have one, and here we have one, but this very last step, which in the case of Kletope is a very significant step, because we have a huge number of degree 3 vertices, right? 2/3 of the vertices are degree 3. And using such a scheme, that means for 2/3 of the vertices, we don't pay anything. That's a fairly good deal. And that's where the n/3 bound comes from. So hence, this is now the end of the proof of this first, or rather the last theorem in the list, but the first one that and the only one that I will completely prove to you, to be honest, today. Every Kletope can be realized as a plane arc diagram with at most n-8/3, which is exactly the lower bound monotone biarcs of a fixed orientation, say down up. And the proof is just, okay, so we have this Kletope is constructed by starting from this orange vertex triangulation of k vertices, let's say. Then we added 2k minus 4 vertices, one into each of these faces. These have degree 3 in the final triangulation. So we kind of ignore these new vertices, so to say, and just apply the previous algorithm on these k vertices that form the starting triangulation. And using this previous algorithm, we get at most k minus 4 biarcs for this, such that every triangle crosses the spine in addition. And now that means we can add all these degree 3 vertices using proper arcs only. So the number of biarcs remains the same as before. However, the count is slightly better, right? Because we have n is 3k minus 4. And then k minus 4 is the same as n minus 8 over 3, which is exactly this bound. So that concludes this argument. And explains why my answer to the question, are cletopes now reasonable candidates to exhibit a monotonicity penalty, is a resounding no, because really there's no penalty whatsoever. We just get it for free, although we have all these many biarcs to work with. The reason at the end being that still their structure is very specific with all these degree 3 vertices. All right. Let me tell you a little bit about planar 3 trees, because also there was this question before. What are they even? So we start with a triangle here, 1, 2, 3. And then we add a vertex in one of the triangles so far. In this case, there are just two choices, kind of the two sides of this triangle. Let me draw it here because it's a bit easier to draw. We add another vertex, and then we can keep a dual structure, which is a tree, where we just mark the faces. So we started with the face 1, 2, 3, one of the triangles, right? And by adding 4, we split this face into 4 new faces, which are now the children of this in this dual tree that I have drawn here in purple on the left. And now we go on with this. We can insert new vertices into one of these facial triangles there and splitting them, and we get a corresponding group of 3 children in the dual tree on the left-hand side and a corresponding bunch of 3 new triangles that subdivide a previous triangle in the primal setting. So this is a planar 3 tree. And now in this dual structure, the interesting thing is not so much the degree of a vertex, because the degree of every vertex is either 3 or 0 for the leaves. Or let's say 1 if you would come, but if you look at it as a rooted tree, kind of the number of children, right? So it's either 3 or none. But the interesting bit is what I call the grandchildren degree. So that is how many of your children have further children and how many of them are leaves. So let me call this GD of a vertex for grand degree. So that's the number of non-leaf children. And that must be some quantity between 0 and 3, right? So for this vertex here, for instance, it's 0. For this, it's 1. For this, it's 2. And I don't have an example for 3, but it could be that in a deeper tree you have this, but no more, because of course any triangle splits into 3 triangles. At most, all of them can be subdivided. Now, the thing is, if we look at any planar 3 tree, then if it has many vertices of grand degree 0, then this tends to be a good thing, because they correspond to degree 3 vertices in the primal. So as in the previous example with the cletopes, where 2/3 of them are like this, right? So any number of degree 3 vertices we could remove and treat the same way as we did for the cletopes. So if there are lots of them, for sure we can get a better bound. That's one intuition here. And the other one is, if we have absolutely no vertices on the other end, like in this example, we have no vertex with a grand degree of 0, then we can actually show that the primal graph must be Hamiltonian, so we don't need any biarc at all. So let me very briefly tell you why. That's very nice and very easy to see. So again, the statement is, if for each vertex in this dual construction tree that tells us how the triangles are subdivided, at least for every vertex, at least one of them is a leaf, that is, it's not further split, then the graph is Hamiltonian. And we can very nicely see this by just drawing a corresponding arc diagram that only uses proper arcs. And we do this by drawing all faces as a drop. So let me show you what I mean by drop. This is a drop, this kind of shape, and of course up to whatever reflection and rotation and so this. And you can see why it's a nice shape, namely because we can subdivide a drop into drops. So if under this assumption, where for every such triangle that we subdivide now, at least one of the children is a leaf, right? So there are three cases. If we subdivide it, there are three triangles, and each of these outer edges of the triangle are involved in exactly one of them. So let's mark these three. So in the left picture here, I say that this first little mountain there is a leaf, here the long edge is a leaf, and here this pocket is a leaf, right? And in all of those cases, we can subdivide so that the other two faces, which are still to be subdivided, are drops again. Only the leaf face is kind of the bad one that doesn't have spine interaction and so on, but we don't care because there's nothing, no vertex is gonna live in there anymore. So we can just draw every face as a drop that is subdivided. So that shows that the graph is Hamiltonian because we don't need any biarcs. So to go back to this statement, I told you that we can get a slightly better bound than the 4/5 for planar 3 trees. And I don't want to go into proof details, but I want to still mention some like high-level ideas of what we do. And it's a bit similar to the Clitope result. Also to the previous one. So in this previous argument, we used a face shape, this drop, what I call drop. That is nice because we can nicely subdivide it into its copies of itself. Of course, once we go away from the graphs that are Hamiltonian, we may eventually need to use some biarcs. So we need a more general face shape to work with. So we need to be a bit more generic while still being convenient. So what we came up with is this kind of shape, which looks a bit like a stylized elephant. So we call it the Ottifant shape. That is a reference to some famous German artist, Otto Walkes, who likes to draw these kind of stylized Ottifants. So you can check Ottifant Day if you want to see what it is about. But anyway, so it's this shape. And the idea is that we don't insist that every triangle is drawn like this, but every triangle is drawn so that it contains at least this shape. So it's okay if, say, the upper edge here would be a mountain, but this biarc kind of shape is contained in it. And it's okay if this would be a pocket, but this is contained in it. It's also okay if this is a pocket, but this is kind of the smallest common denominator that we insist be there to work with so as to insert vertices and draw edges. And restricting ourselves to this makes this bearable in terms of cases to consider. And the next thing is that we don't insist on vertices being added one by one. Or we do this, but not in an oblivious fashion. We don't think of it as a dynamic problem where now some adversary gives us the next vertex to consider, but we have to look ahead a little bit and anticipate what's gonna come there in the future. And then, as you could expect from this intuition that I told you first there, if there's no grand degree 3 vertex, then it's Hamiltonian to begin with. If we have lots of grand degree 0 vertices, then it's also easy because these are degree 3 vertices, which we can just add without requiring any further biarcs. At the same time, if we have loads of grand degree 3 guys, right? I mean, if we have high degree vertices in a tree, then there must also be more leaves. So there is this kind of trade-off. And a similar thing for the degree 2 and degree 1 ones. So their interaction is maybe the most annoying one to handle there. But it's not too bad, actually, because of restricting to this Ottifant shape. This is a reasonably nice proof, as these kind of proofs go, I think. But of course, I'm biased. All right, so do I still have time, or should we wrap it up here? So, I mean, the only thing
if you want a few more minutes, that's okay, up to you.
Okay, so I mean, I'm not going to no further details. I will just go in a similar way over some ideas, high-level ideas of what we use in this 4n/5 bound here, and then that will be that. So this is maybe the most interesting because it's the most general kind of these theorems. It's also the one that has the most involved proof, and that took us the longest time kind of to get in a shape where we are happy with the trade-off between proof complexity and improvement in the bound achieved. So first of all, we go away from just having, in some sense, some adversary give us a canonical ordering, but we dynamically pick our canonical ordering as we go. Then, that's a breakthrough, of course, the introduction of pocket money, as many kids would agree. So far we only put credits on mountains if their left endpoint was on the outer face, but now we also require money for pockets, namely 1/5 of a credit, which is exactly the 1/5 that we gain here in this bound. And then we also batch insert vertices. So we go completely away from inserting them one by one. And for each of these intermediate stages, maintain a valid arc diagram with these invariants. But sometimes we just consider whatever linear size subset of things that we throw in as a bunch, for instance, by doing some kind of recursion or induction, if you want, on a separating triangle. And only after all of these vertices have been added, we obtain again a valid representation with all these invariants. So these are the three key differences, I would say. And then, of course, there are lots of details of how exactly to implement it and how to make sure that it works out in the end. So to summarize, open problems. There are lots of gaps that would be interesting to close. So taking away all these additive constants, we have the general gap between 1/3 and 1/2 regarding the number of biarcs, the maximum number of biarcs required for every planar graph on n vertices. And for the monotone case, it's even slightly larger. And you could even conceivably distinguish between the case where you allow both monotone type of arcs and only one of them. All the upper bounds that we have actually will also work for the more restricted setting. Then for planar 3 trees, we don't expect this bound to be tight either. And you could also ask about approximation algorithms. So given that for the only family of graphs for which we know the lower bound in all of these settings to be tight, we know the exact answer. Actually, it might be that our approximation that we would get is better than what these upper and lower bounds suggest here, right? Because so no idea. The computational complexity of minimization, of course, that we expect to be hard in all of these problems. Another interesting question, I think, is the impact of bounded degree. For instance, if you look at planar graph of maximum degree 4, then it's known that they are always sub-Hamiltonian. Also for 3 connected graphs of maximum degree 5. So this is not obvious, but it can be shown. And for, I believe, 7 at least, there are examples that they are counter-examples, so to say, and even hardness results. But for instance, for 3 connected degree 6, I think also nothing would be known. So the interaction of degree bounds with these kind of questions and Hamiltonicity, I think it is interesting. And let's leave it at that for now. Thank you very much for being here and listening to me mumbling.